Okay. Well, we're really dwindling here as the semester wraps up finally. All right. So before we get back to the lecture here, a couple of announcements. Number one, directly before class, I finished grading your fourth and last assignment. To anyone out there, if there is a late submission or if you sent something by email and it's not graded yet, please send me an email and remind me. I do check and I get an alert when there's a submission to the late submissions Dropbox, but Canvas is kind of fucky sometimes. So just let me know if something got missed. I want to make sure I take care of it sooner rather than later. Announcement 2 is your final exam will open up. I'm going to open it up early. Actually, this kind of ties in with another announcement. I guess I'll get to that one first. This is your last full week of classes. We will be here today. We will be here Wednesday. We will be here Monday. And then the following Wednesday, the 14th, we will not be meeting in person. And then we're not going to be meeting in person because I'm going to give you that time so that you can work on anything else that you need to get done, do your term paper, prepare for the exam, that kind of thing. And then the final exam will open on the 15th. And you can take that anytime between the 15th and when it closes at the end of finals week on the 22nd. The term paper is still due on the 18th. So you've got about 2 weeks now to complete that. All right, so hopefully that time next week will be helpful. Where else? I guess that's it. Yeah. I can't think of anything I'm forgetting, but yeah, but especially if there's ungraded items, let me know. Okay. All right, when we left off last week, we were talking about misinformation, disinformation, and essentially corruption of information dissemination and consumption systems. And we left off with some methods. So there are two main ways in which misinformation and disinformation will be intentionally spread, keeping in mind from last week that sometimes it's not really an intentional thing. Sometimes it's just a matter of, people don't necessarily have a specific agenda, but either they don't understand what they're sharing, or it's just for entertainment purposes, or it's a hoax, or part of some overarching conspiracy theory or something like that. What we're talking about with seeding and and echoing, we're talking about concerted efforts from people with the resources, whether they be nation states, cyber terrorists, or what have you, in order to control messaging online. And these are often parts of an ecosystem that aren't even necessarily even aware of each other's existence. So seeding, as we talked about last week, is basically when stories are planted, deceptions, fake news, I don't care what you want to call it, whatever. Basically are inserted into the information dissemination systems, but just putting them out there alone isn't really going to have much of an impact unless it gets picked up. Just like everything else online, if it doesn't go viral, it's going to be often, even if it does go viral, it's forgotten fairly quickly. But if it doesn't catch on, no one's going to know about it. And that's why there's usually also groups that are responsible for echoing. So seeding might be part of even an official like state media network, or a group that is just essentially officially just a disinformation system. And echoing is something that amplifies that message. So it gets it out there, that puts it in front of the algorithm, that gets it up to the top of the page, gets people talking about it. Not necessarily the same group as those that do the seeding, although in some cases they are, but is often more of a dedicated network of individuals rather than just because, the internet's a big place. So just having, 5 to a dozen people, upvoting and downvoting or sharing and favoriting and that kind of thing is often not enough to do it. Echoing, seeding is all about verisimilitude. It's all about planting the stories in the right places. It's about implanting, again, as we talked about with conspiracy theory, that seed of plausibility. It's about crafting the message, making sure that it's believable, it's shareable, that it's coming from a source that seems to be legitimate, that's not too easily discounted. That itself is an art form, whereas echoing is really about making it seem as if it's something that people are talking about, making sure, again, that it's pushed up to the top of the page, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of different ways this works. It's not necessarily just about algorithm manipulation, although essentially, while the infrastructure of the internet, the actual technologies at play aren't specifically meant for misinformation and disinformation spreading, it just so happens that the mechanisms that we have developed in order to share information online make themselves particularly easy for those so inclined to be manipulated. So sometimes you'll just get the straight up manipulation of search rankings, either from, again, the aforementioned engagement or artificial engagement, or by literally just paying to appear higher up in search rankings, trying to drown out any actual information or contradictory information in some cases. Sometimes there's actual cybercrime involved, hacking and so on, just to plant stories, or again, it's not always necessarily about getting the message out there. Sometimes it's about suppressing alternative messages. And so on. That's about where we left off. All right, so we also self-select content online. We've talked a couple of times, I think, about what echo chambers are. We did briefly mention the concept of a filter bubble a couple of weeks ago, but if you've forgotten what that is, a filter bubble is essentially not necessarily people self-selecting content to reside in echo chambers, but when platforms or moderators on platforms intentionally create a series of arbitrary rules, it automatically de-incentivizes engagement by any other alternative message. And yeah, I'm thinking about Reddit here. I don't know if anyone here is, a fan of Reddit or anything like that. It's not exactly the most popular place on the internet anymore these days. It's just one of the places other people are going. Twitter might be an example, but Reddit is a much easier example because it's gotten kind of insane. So Reddit, if you're not familiar with it, basically a message board system where there's what are known as subreddits, and on the subreddits, they're delineated by topic, and those topics are by policy of the platform, moderated. So volunteer moderators will take it upon themselves, or will be promoted by subreddit creators to make sure that content doesn't violate the site's terms of service, or whatever other particular sensitivities or proclivities of the moderators and creator. So they can make whatever rules they want, is essentially what it amounts to. Some of those might be fairly arbitrary distinctions, things like you have to have a certain amount of karma, those fake internet points, in order to even participate in any conversation on those subreddits. Others might be, and they're literally completely arbitrary. Make up any rule you want, it can be a rule of your subreddit. It's not as if there's anyone to complain to anyway. That's a perfect example of a filter bubble, because on some subreddits, maybe that have a de facto or specified political leaning, for example, they might immediately see any content that doesn't agree with whatever the current party's particular policies happen to be trolling. Assume it will be removed, right? People don't get to see those messages. They just get removed or banned or what have you. So that makes that subreddit an echo chamber, but the moderation makes it a filter bubble. Anyone who goes there expects to be protected from that kind of content. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, because if you take it to an extreme, as you always should, of course, there's, logical fallacies, ad reductum, and so on, where if you take anything to a reductive point, eventually it just becomes bizarre and illogical. But take an extreme example. There are plenty of subreddits that cater to adult material. And if that was unmoderated, it obviously could lead to a point where people are posting things that most, in a democratic sense, visitors to that subreddit aren't interested in seeing. See, for example, the case of a subreddit known as Trees. So in the early days of Reddit, there was r/trees, a subreddit that was created initially for arborists, enthusiasts of actual trees, but which was brigaded and quickly taken over by marijuana enthusiasts, I guess. And so now if you visit r/trees, that's what you're going to find. It's just simply been the case. Again, in a democratic sense, if the majority of users of a particular platform want a certain thing, then that thing will prevail. And that filter bubble will be created as moderators take on that role and filter out anything else. And so in revenge, by the way, actual arborists, actual tree enthusiasts started r/marijuana enthusiasts, and that's where you go to talk about trees. So what we're talking about here with feedback loops is, yeah, echo chambers and filter bubbles, but really with disinformation and misinformation, what we're really talking about in this sense is how are echo chambers and filter bubbles used for the proliferation or the campaigns of misinformation and disinformation that we see. So what we see, and there's been a lot of research, especially recently on this, I mean, for obvious reasons, we're now all of a sudden very interested in what has been otherwise an intrinsic and indelible part of the internet since its inception. But now that we're actually facing consequences for it, my God, we must figure this thing out, right? What we see in research is that essentially disinformation campaigns, and I refer to them as campaigns because they are, whether officially sanctioned or not, conceptualized as basically an organized program, one that plays upon, if you refer to our social engineering unit, the ability for people to be manipulated en masse by particularly engaging in oppositional fantasies. So we've talked a number of times about how, actually, I think it might even be on a slide or two back. Well, I guess it's not worth hunting for it. I guess I'll just repeat it. Filter bubbles and echo chambers aren't necessarily the problem that we once suspected that they might be. The idea around 2014, 2015, leading up to the 2016 election, was that people subjecting themselves to echo chambers and filter bubbles adhere to whatever the marching orders, whatever the prevailing values of their echo chambers happen to be, because they never faced or were even exposed to any alternative viewpoints. And that if we could just get sanitary information sharing systems, one which essentially provided the truth, as I guess however you specifically define it, that it would allow people to make their own rational choices without regards to disinformation, misinformation, or what have you. And as I mentioned a couple of times, we've found since then that it's not really the case, that it turns out that self-selecting content, it certainly doesn't help matters, but that even those who are exposed to alternative viewpoints still don't change their mind. And what is the reason for that? Well, further research has shown that part of that reason is because of a problem. No, I consider it a problem, I guess, but because of our sense of self, our own ideal self, what we were talking about with avatar creation, what we were talking about with behavioral schemas, what we've been talking about with persona ex machina. The way we operate is based on how we see ourselves and how we see each other. And we get locked in, as it turns out, into what are called oppositional fantasies. You also hear this sometimes described as culture wars, or cultural issues, or what have you. Basically, it's not a matter of not being exposed to alternative viewpoints. It's that alternative viewpoints, even when we are exposed to them, are easily discounted, not by the information that we have received in echo chambers. It's not the information necessarily itself. It's the rhetorical ammunition, the actual language that we learn as a result of our exposure in the process of gaining this information, that really causes us to dig into these oppositional fantasies, to identify our sense of self with one position or another. And that makes it particularly resilient, even when exposed to other information, even when exposed, as it so happens, to the stark, bald-faced truth. Hence the promotion of what have become alternative facts, right? So it's a cultural issue. It's not about information. It's about culture. It's about identity. It's about us versus them. It's tribalization, right? So maintaining things like grudges and such, disinformation and misinformation programs thrive in this environment because it's very easy to promote a message when you identify it, number one, from a source that is one of the good ones, whatever that is defined as in the particular culture or what have you. And the message which either glorifies us or vilifies them. And it has a reinforcing effect, right? If you consume content from a source you consider to be reputable, you will go into that echo chamber. You'll consume more content from that person. That will lead to other content, which is also indicated somehow by that first source as another one of the good ones. That further reinforces. Well, you've probably heard of pipelines before as well. That's what we're talking about, right? Internet pipelines, alt-right pipelines, Antifa pipelines, or what have you. That leads to radicalization. It's because disinformation and misinformation not only is good for those disseminating the information, not in the sense that even, well, let's, if we take Neonopoulos, Jones, Fuentes, any of these people, or shit, if we want to go back to 2008, Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, or whatever, which isn't to say that none of these people are true believers. They might be, they might not be. It doesn't matter. It's actually completely immaterial. They share these messages as part of the information dissemination system because, as we talked about with Lysig's framework, they have an economic incentive to do so. Glenn Beck sold more books, had more viewers, had more subscribers. Rush Limbaugh, more books, more appearances, so on. Same thing with everybody else. To the point where Nick Fuentes is apparently now the campaign manager for Easy. It's amazing what shit posting on the internet can get you these days, I guess. So it's a reinforcing effect. They have an economic incentive and perhaps an ideological incentive to spread the message. They have an economic and perhaps ideological incentive to share viewership, right, with other people. They get their own tie-ins, their own deals. And other people with a vested interest in spreading information. They love the system too, because they can provide content, get their message out, right? And it kind of works out for everybody, except of course for the people who in the middle are essentially being used, right? So that's just kind of where we're at right now. If any part of what I just said sounds like it's not necessarily the truth, that's because it might not be. We don't really have a full grasp on exactly how this all plays out and exactly what the consequences of all of this are. All we can say for certain at this point is that our information sharing and dissemination systems are most certainly not what they should be. Certainly not what we thought they would be in the late 90s, certainly not where they could be. Is there a lot of incentive right now to make any changes? No, there's not. And the reason for that is because of the aforementioned market incentives. There's no reason, if you own a platform on the internet, to essentially not allow misinformation. There is an incentive, as we see with Meta and Twitter and various other sources. There is incentive to take steps to make it appear as if you're fighting misinformation and disinformation, because you want trustworthiness in your platform. You want people to use your platform and not become too associated with one side or another on any particular issue, because then you're alienating half of your potential customer base. So there's just simply not any market incentives, nor is there any political will to really do anything about it. The alternative, of course, I mean, what does a good information dissemination system look like? What does one look like that's not going to be subject to misinformation and disinformation campaigns, there was an idea a little while ago that the best information dissemination systems would be unfiltered, direct from the source, right? If you get raw news directly from individuals without any interpretation at all, well, that would be the best way to go about it. And there actually was a study done about that where people were basically isolated for a short amount of time, and they were given only raw numbers on information. Well, as it turns out, that didn't work out so well either, because because we require some level of interpretation. Without some explanation as to the significance of certain information, it is impossible to sort what we need to know, what we want to know, from, well, just noise. It's all noise at the end of the day. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Another way that platforms play a role in this too. Platforms actually led to the eventual conclusion that it was not a matter of simple echo chambers being an issue with people kind of digging in on certain positions. Because as it turned out, after places like Facebook and Twitter began to fight misinformation and disinformation in the studies that they ran on individuals who were getting their news from these sources, they found that they were reading plenty of disparate sources. It's just that they couldn't tell which was fake and which was real, which was truth, which was exaggeration, because it was all being presented in their feed equally. And so that's another problem we have with feedback loops, is that all information is presented as if it were presumed to be legitimate, and if it is presumed to be illegitimate, it's simply removed, which gives people a false sense of security in terms of whether or not what they're seeing is actually news or not. So another problem with the information dissemination systems. Not all sources are equal. Sometimes headlines are just clickbait. Let's see. There's another subreddit out there. It's r/saved you a click. It's a place that users will post headlines for news stories and then quickly follow it up with what the actual news story says. So I think I saw an example a couple of days ago. It was something like, it was something salacious in the headline. What was it? Something like, main star of National Treasure won't be back for #3. And then the saved you a click version was, it's some bit like somebody who was one of the extras or something in the other one. And it turns out they have another engagement. That was the story. Let's see. Oh yeah. As far as the reach of misinformation and disinformation goes, how bad of a problem is this in terms of its scope? Even if it does influence individuals and opinions, can it lead to, for example, actual decision makers at, foreign policy, State Department level, or an intelligence agency level? Can it have any effect there? And as it turns out, according to studies on misinformation, disinformation, that doesn't seem to be the case. And we have to ask ourselves, why that might be, because they're people too. They're on social media too. Well, as it turns out, these people, it seems, are in a better position to be able to actualize the raw data sources that would otherwise drive most of us insane. So the intelligence community and foreign policy community, they get direct information from the State Department, from intelligence services or other data feeds. They have access to see literally what is going on at any given point. And so while public opinion can sway for or against them with the decisions that they make as a result, we haven't found, at least at this point, any really significant examples of disinformation actually having an effect on policy itself. So here's a little diagram to help you conceptualize this. Seeding and echoing. It's just a process of planting the stories and then echoing it. But again, it's a multifaceted process. And this comes from that study that I have down there. Feel free to look it up yourself if you like. Echo chambers, how disinformation circulates in social media through identity-driven controversies. So Basically, as we talked about before, platforms have an economic incentive to actually host controversial content. Of course, they say they don't like it, they say they don't want it, but they actually do, right? As long as it's not too bad, and as long as it doesn't make them look bad, because they don't want to drive the advertisers. I mean, Elon wants another bite of that apple, real bad. But if it doesn't involve them, then they want controversial content because that drives clicks. They want people to come and visit the site, they want people to use it. And if Twitter, for example, if it has become the place after Pastebin, where, for example, hacking groups will post news about their latest data breaches, I don't know anybody in the cybersecurity community right now that's not following various different accounts on Twitter. It's just where things happen in that field right now. So they want that controversial content. So in the process of echoing, if it's controversial, it's not hard to find a platform. Somebody is going to be more than willing to host it. Doesn't violate the TOS, they're not going to touch it. That controversy drives attention. That attention brings in alternative viewpoints, that causes arguments, that brings in more attention, and that further polarizes and divides people along ideological or identity lines or what have you. This amplifies the message to the point where, you know, actual stories that aren't driving the conversation, that aren't controversial or driving any argumentation, well, that is much quieter by comparison. All right, so a while ago in our social engineering unit, we talked about manipulation techniques against individuals. A lot of those techniques don't actually manipulate individuals, they manipulate people who witness the individual having an argument of some kind. I figured we would detail a couple more here, especially since after finishing up the final exam, I noticed that there was a couple of them that I cut that I probably shouldn't have. So continuation of that, I guess. So first of all, we have what's known as poisoning the well. This is controlling narratives by changing focus to favorable or unfavorable viewpoints. So like, for example, here, if I am a majority owner in Tesla, I want that stock to go up. If I promote Tesla directly, it's not likely to have too much of an impact because people will just say, well, he's shilling for his company. Of course I am. Just don't want people to know that's what I'm doing. So instead, what I might do is I might choose to promote either directly or through alternative sources, articles and information that supports Tesla as a company. Problem with that is there might not be that much good news. We might, for example, have a little bit of a problem with the Security and Exchange Commission. We might have a little problem with exploding batteries and stuff. So maybe it's a light news, like good news day for us. It's been a rough couple of weeks, but that's okay. I don't actually need to promote the product. Also, keep in mind that if you recall our unit on valence and the impact, the dominance of certain things, content that is favorable to a product is not exactly awe-inspiring. It doesn't have a high level of dominance. It's not really likely to elicit much controversy or conversation. So a better way is, instead of making my product look good, I'll make other products look bad. I'm going to start a fight online. I'm going to get nerds to slap fight over, let's say, for example, public transportation infrastructure, right? I'll talk about how subways are dirty and dangerous, but how what we really need is a hyperloop that goes around the entire world. Right? That's what we need. Climate change articles. I'll link articles or start conversations about the dangers of internal combustion engine vehicles, about how they contribute to lead poisoning and give fish 3 eyes, all that kind of stuff. And I'll promote stories vilifying the oil industry. They don't have to be false. I mean, the oil industry doesn't need a whole lot of help vilifying themselves, but I'll make sure that the message gets broadcast, right? So that'd be poisoning the well. I'm setting the tone of the conversation. And from there on, it's really easy to use some of the other manipulation techniques that we talked about last time. Anybody who comes in and Mr. Two PhDs talking about how, well, urban sprawl is a problem, but actually the climate impact of electric vehicles and blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't need to hear from that nerd. So instead, I'll just say, well, what are you saying? Are you shilling for the oil industry? Are you a Shell executive or something? Do you like it when children are hit by internal combustion engine cars, which is proven to be more fatal than electric vehicles because they're lighter than air? Doesn't matter if it's true or not, right? I'm not going to convince them. I might convince the people who are watching the conversation. We also have some manipulation techniques based upon the frailty of human ego, as bandwagoning and peer influence. There's a reason why so many campaigns for teens and young children try to give kids the, usually very poorly, give kids the tools they need to resist peer pressure. It's a very powerful force for young children. We don't like to admit it. It's a very powerful force for adults too. It's not something that generally goes away, at least not for everybody. I got a couple of older kids, and I can't remember what we were talking about. It was a couple of years ago during the pandemic. They were worried about something or other with their friends or something like that. They didn't get what the problem was. I was like, why do you care what those idiots think? Who cares? And then I realized that there's no 16-year-old that's ever lived that didn't care what other people think. It's not something that you're born with. It's something that you acquire over time. You just stop giving a shit about what other people think of you. You eventually grow up and realize that, as it turns out, most adults are making it up as they go along, and everyone's an idiot anyway. So, but it is a powerful force for most of us, including most adults. And so the tendency with misinformation and disinformation campaigns and the echoing process is just to get the ball rolling, right? You don't have to do all of the work to downvote something to oblivion to get it off the page. Usually all you have to do is get that number into the negative, keep pushing in that direction, and then everyone else will come in and start doing the work for you. It's also easy to use peer influence, particularly among friend groups, which is why last time when we met, I was talking about how sometimes these groups, whether they be official state actors or APTs or what have you, will secretly, clandestinely make inroads with various different groups, right? The Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Proud Boys, and so on. If they have a message that they believe that they can use them to send, it's not going to be a matter of quid pro quo. They're not going to say, I'll give you $10,000 if you start posting about this online. Why would they spend the money if they don't have to? They make friends somewhere along the way. Maybe they eventually join up and go hunting together or something like that. They just share the group, share the story with that person or with the group. And because of peer influence, they're friends, they know them, they're one of the good ones. So it's a good fella over there. And they'll gladly promote the story, just assuming that considering the source, it must surely be true. So when we have a lot of amplification organically from actual users of a site, that's bandwagoning. You see something getting downvoted, there's another subreddit now that I think of it, I can't remember what it's called. But it's a subreddit dedicated to calling out when one comment just randomly is selected somehow for extreme bandwagoning on downvotes. Like there'll be 3 identical comments and 1 out of the 3 is somehow selected by enough people that it's like downvoted into the negative triple or quadruple digits. I don't know, it's weird. Peer influence and bandwagoning. Right. If you can get the ball rolling, that's usually all it takes, right? We already talked about Bernaysian psychology. It sometimes just takes a little push, right place, right time, right direction, and it'll be enough. There's also what's known as manipulated prevalence. So in the process of echoing, if you have misinformation or disinformation, making things seem as if, for example, everyone is talking about this, right? If you open up your browser, of course, the first place you go to, as everybody does, yahoo.com. And you see that there's a story right on the front page from God knows where. Something about, I guess, sure, climate change, right? Why not? A story about how Campbell's soup or something like that is contributing to climate change. You say, well, that seems terrible, but okay, you go on with your day. So you go on your first social media site, you see people talking about it on Twitter. Okay, that's weird, but fine. You see people posting about it on Reddit. You see people making TikToks about it. It's all over the place. Everyone's talking about Campbell's soup. It must be terrible. Right? That's a manipulated prevalence. It's pretty easy to cross-post things. That's what viral content does. If you can get it on a couple of sites, again, if you get the ball rolling, you can see that the message seems to be more pervasive than it actually is. And we had talked before about problems with our information dissemination systems back in the old days with print media. One of the issues is that the print media would print a story desperately wanting to be first because they wanted to get the scoop. That meant more subscribers. That meant they became the paper of record. And so they really wanted to get that story out first, even if it weren't necessarily completely true. But that's okay because they would just print a retraction. But of course, the retraction comes out 3 weeks later. It's on page 5 and nobody reads it. So the mistake is still believed. That's a concept known as uncorrectability. And as you might surmise, it's an even bigger problem somehow now that we have the ability to publish anything we want. So somebody can publish a story. The person who the story is about, they can print their own story. It's the internet. You can publish anything you want. Other people can get to the bottom of it and they can publish their own story. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be believed. So I have so many videos out there. YouTubers who get themselves into hot water and deny everything, and nobody ever believes them. I guess that's not necessarily fair. Most of the time, it's not true anyway. So. There's also the concept known as mere exposure, where people tend to prefer and trust things merely because they're familiar with them. I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with another phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, but my assumption is that by this point in your lives, you've probably heard about that before. But yeah, people tend to prefer and trust things merely because they're familiar with them. This is also part of peer influence too, because we tend to trust people inside our group. People in our in-group are trusted, people in our out-group are automatically distrusted unless they can prove themselves. All right, so we talked a little while ago about the 2013 Snowden leak and about how it seemed as if the NSA and various other government organizations were using their positions following the 2001 Patriot Act in order to, without the knowledge of the general public here in the United States, surveil on our own citizens without warrants or any regard really to any constitutional rights whatsoever. Now that's verifiable. We know that. It was leaked. Everybody knows it now. But you might not know that it wasn't their first try. Not by a long shot. So in terms of misinformation and disinformation campaigns and just state actor campaigns in general, the US is not the most common actor out in the cyber warfare landscape. But it is definitely, well, I don't know about definitely, I guess. We don't have a complete picture of the information. So I guess instead what I'll say is, with the information that we have available to us, it does seem to be one of the strongest and I'm going to use a word here that's not going to get me in trouble. Most versatile. They seem to be capable of a lot of pretty crazy things. But what they have at their disposal, according to the 2013 leaks and various leaks that have occurred since then, is basically they've used their position as a 3-letter government agency in order to basically get their fingers into a lot of different pies across the technology economy, right? So the major players like Google and Apple and Microsoft and all of that, they've been able to convince them or coerce them into giving them access to this information. But obviously the NSA, just as anybody would prefer to not have to go through third parties for that kind of information. And they did. They tried that. It didn't work out for them. So the problem that they had with their first try was this thing over here on the right. This is known as a clipper chip. So back in 1994, make sure I get my date right. Yeah, back in 1994, the NSA wanted to start using these clipper chips, which were basically hardware keys using something called a skipjack algorithm. It was proprietary, closed source. The NSA, or was it closed source? Yep. They classified. I guess, yeah. I mean, it was government information, but they classified it as secret, which meant that none of the cryptographic systems inside could actually be peer reviewed. So, I guess not technically closed source because it was government information, but ostensibly closed source because you needed to have secret clearance in order to even see the documentation. So, yeah, they wanted this installed in devices in order to provide a security layer. The only people to adopt it was the Department of Justice. Everyone else immediately, especially in the cybersecurity community back in the mid-90s, as you see there on the left, immediately caught wind of this thing and said something smells funny. I don't like the look of this at all. You want us to start using this chip to provide encryption, but you own the keys and you know everything about it. No one else can know anything about it. The term for that is security through obscurity, and that's not how we generally like to do things. So by 1996, the project was more or less dead, with the DOJ being the only adopters. Maybe this should have been a clue, I guess, at the time as to what eventually the goals would happen to be. But back then, in the 90s, remember, the internet was a very different place. And so the Cyber Rights Now movement, the St. Clipper movement, could get traction because there was a lot less information. And the information sources that we had online were, well, it was a better quality than we're dealing with right now. By 2013, the reason that the Snowden leak was even a surprise to anyone, I can't take that, is because by then, our information systems had gotten to the point where most had all but forgotten about the Clipper chip. So the NSA tried to engage in the process of manipulation in this case, but in the 90s, they had to rely on print media. It was a lot harder to pull the wool over the eyes of the field itself. And of course, mid-90s, there was a very different sentiment among cybersecurity professionals as well in terms of security and exchange of information, and who's ethically allowed to know what information and all that things as well. Now, by 2016, of course, the Snowden leak had already happened, and we were well aware, or should have been aware, rather, of what had been going on underneath our very noses. It happened in the mid-90s. It happened in 2013. And of course, there's the Snowden effect, which, if you were to hear some people, even reputable sources, talk about it, they would tell you that it was ultimately not necessarily a completely bad thing anyway, because the NSA, as a result, dismantled some of their most violating, I guess, systems. There was the court case for those Somali citizens who were arrested and tried, and the judge found that it was unconstitutional, the data that the NSA had gathered, which was used in part in their conviction, but that it didn't matter anyway, because the NSA had dismantled that system and the one that came after it. Well, we shouldn't have been surprised, again, for the third time, 2016. Maybe you've heard of this one. It's a little bit more recent, the Shadow Brokers. Shadow Broker being taken from the extraordinarily popular Mass Effect series of games. In this case, it was not, well, okay, so the NSA, they did an internal investigation after this second leak, and they suspected an insider. But in this case, what the cybersecurity community has come up to, as far as where this came from, is not likely to be an insider. It just doesn't look like an insider. So contradicting the NSA's official story, generally speaking, it's widely accepted that the shadow broker dump was a message being sent from one state-sponsored hacking group to the NSA, which was, look what we can do, back off, or we can make it much worse. It was kind of a threat, right? Shadow broker dump was a series of 5 messages that were sent out. So what it was is essentially 3 years after the Snowden leak, proof that the NSA had not dismantled anything, that they were continuing their operations. They had just decided instead to adopt, well, what is colloquially known as the Russian system. So Russia, in terms of cyber warfare operations, very prolific. Between 2017 and 2021, Russian state-sponsored groups and APTs responsible for 58% of all state-related cybercrime, including disinformation and misinformation campaigns. But they have plausible deniability because the way that they handle things is they have fewer state-sponsored groups and more advanced persistent threat groups, APTs. So pseudo or semi-official groups. Basically, they operate as cells, right? They have their own individual objectives, their own individual leadership. They just kind of do their own thing. And Russia kind of vaguely points them in the right direction occasionally. The NSA, as it turns out, after 2013, decided to adopt that same model. So now we have APTs. One of them was known as the Equation Group, tied to the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, or TAO unit. And the shadow brokers showed over a series of 5 dumps that they still had hacking tools, zero-day exploits, all of that good stuff still running in the background, being accrued, and had actually, I don't know, actually, now that I think of it, I might be spreading misinformation here on my own because I can't remember if this was an official story or just a shitpost I found on a forum somewhere. But I'm going to repeat it anyway, but take it with a grain of salt because this might not be true. But if I remember correctly, part of the dump also included communications with certain executives at, for example, Microsoft, where Microsoft told them that they believed that one of the tools the Equation Group was using had been leaked and they wanted to plug the security hole. And the NSA had replied not to because they were using that exploit for national defense, I guess. Right. So I'm not going to go into a super lot of detail in the shadow brokers. I'm merely pointing out that as far as all of this goes, this is a process of evolution. What we once experienced as cyber warfare, intel operations, what is known as information warfare from the 90s has changed significantly to the point where now, in the span of just like 3 years, a thing can happen. Nobody really understands it. Nobody really talks about it. It has widespread effects and things are better now. And then we find out, oh, well, no, they're not, right? We just don't have good information sharing systems, which is a problem because we've been talking about state actors here, but I mean, that's terrifying enough really when you think about it. But the idea that all of these systems are more or less accessible to the public means that it doesn't have to be an official state-sponsored group in order to actually affect any kind of misinformation, disinformation, cyber warfare. Any kind of attack really can be done by just about anybody with the proper skills and the appropriate motivation, which brings us to one of the newest, not entirely unrealized, but I mean, honestly, nothing bad enough has happened that everyone probably knows about it yet, but it's definitely going to happen sometime soon. Cyber terrorism. So the use of computers to launch a terrorist attack. I mean, I guess arguably there's plenty of examples of this. Anytime you have a hacking collective that targets an enterprise or government organization or something like that, I guess technically, according to the FBI's definition, it could be considered to be terrorism. But ultimately, what we're really talking about is cyber terrorism in the traditional sense, the use of fear to affect some kind of political change by leveraging that fear for policy. And we haven't really got an example where actual government policy has yet been affected by this. I think we'll all get to experience it together, so we can look forward to that. So what we're worried about here with cyber terrorism is severe economic damage. Not that long ago, there was another subreddit, I guess since I'm talking about Reddit a lot today, called Wall Street Bets. Wall Street Bets was I can't remember how many subs they had to that subreddit, a couple 100K, something like that. It's not a small subreddit. Somebody posted a couple of years ago that they thought GME, GameStop, was the next stock to go to the moon, which isn't unusual for that subreddit, right? It's basically shit posting about stocks. So, people post every day about what they think is going to go up and what they think is going to go down. Through a series of events and coincidences, it's one of those things, bandwagoning, and everyone began to have faith that GME was going to turn things around and they were going to go from what looked to be on the brink of complete collapse to sudden, inexplicable success. But it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because of bandwagoning and peer influence, people started buying up tons of stock in GME. Oh, that's what it was. The original post noted that part of the reason for the devaluation of GameStop as a commodity in terms of its stocks was that a venture capital firm or investment firm or something like that had over-leveraged, bought options for GameStop in the hopes of devaluing it and making a bunch of money themselves. And they basically said, we can stick it to Wall Street. We can stick it to the suits at the venture capital firms. If we just hold on, buy and hold your stock, make the price go up, cost them billions of dollars. And that was a message that a lot of people could get behind because, well, they're suits, fuck them. So that's what they did, right? A bunch of people came eventually to be known as apes, because apes together strong from, Planet of the Apes, bought and held their GME stock, and it actually did end up costing that firm a lot of money. 16, no, it can't be, there's no way it can be billion. I don't know, maybe it is. The stock market's all gambling anyway. But it was at least half of their available capital, which for a firm like that, which relies on capital to function, a major problem. And it actually scared the shit out of a lot of people who do regulation for Wall Street, because suddenly people were using the stock market the way they were always told they could use it, to buy stock and, speculate on the value of companies. It was one of those things where it's like, yeah, give us money, we'll manage it for you. Oh, no, not like that. You're doing it wrong, kind of a thing. But part of the reason why so many people were afraid of that, and so many people, when I say people, as in regulation of stocks and bonds, is because they realized that this was essentially a decentralized potential attack vector on the stock market, where if somebody were so inclined and had the ability to broadcast a message, they could target companies for either promotion, which is good for that company, or destruction, if they so desired. And so that's not really a question that has been answered yet, because this is still kind of an evolving situation even now. But you can bet there will be legislation in the future that will somehow try to regulate that without stopping, of course, the eternal flow of money into the stock market, which is absolutely required. Or what happens again? Heat death of the universe? I don't know, something bad. And of course, disruption to communications. US v. Mitra. Gentleman down in Madison, Wisconsin here, got himself a radio jammer and jammed up all emergency communication for the Madison Metro Police Department back in 2005. That was, at the time, not classified as a cyber terror attack because we did not have any cyber terrorism laws on the books at the time. It wasn't something that we really considered. The Obama administration swiftly changed that. So now if something like that were to be done, disruption to communication would be included in the federal definition for cyber terrorism. And that is also something that we are quite afraid of, although not afraid enough to break up telecom companies and insist on the decentralized communication platform the internet was originally designed to be. Enough said. As of the problems we had during the COVID pandemic, and of course the bottleneck of the Suez Canal, 3 days, we realized fairly recently that we have some information and transportation issues in our supply lines, things which could be easily exploited if one were so inclined, and could lead to billions of dollars in economic loss worldwide. We are worried about the general degradation of national infrastructure as well. A lot of the equipment that we're currently using, although infrastructure-wise, in terms of actual transmission lines in the United States, we are rolling out more fiber optic, and that's great. It allows for better, more consistent, faster communication. It's also more fragile, right? And on top of that, we don't have fiber everywhere. I mean, Jesus, in this country, there are places where we don't even have broadband still. So we have still people who rely on their communication entirely on antiquated analog systems, which convert analog to digital in order to connect to modern telephone infrastructure. That is an extremely big Achilles heel for us. And all of this is possible, unlike back in 2001 when the Patriot Act was passed and the internet was a thing that people were kind of using at that point. The possibility of being able to, for example, turn out the lights on millions of people by breaking into an industrial control system was the thing of near future science fiction. Now that's no longer the case. All of these things are technically targetable, could be done at any point, at any time, by anyone, anywhere in the world. So all of this major problems for the future for us. All right, we're about time here, so next time we'll go on to specific attacks. So, take care.